2 days shy of her 41st birthday, shotgun blasts ripped through the quiet hills of the Indian Territory. She was shot in the back, a coward's ambush. The woman they called the Bandit Queen lay dead in the dirt, just feet from her own gate. The dime novels painted her as a female Jesse James, a ruthless outlaw. But that's the legend. How does a girl who mastered Greek and the piano, born to a respectable family, end her days this way? Today, we separate the truth from the lies to find the real Myra Maybelle Shirley and to ask the question that still haunts these hills. Who wanted her dead? Before the legend, there was a girl named Myra Maybelle Shirley. She wasn't born in a dusty outlaw camp, but into a life of relative comfort in Carthage, Missouri. Her father, John Shirley, was a respected farmer, innkeeper, and judge, a man of property and standing. Their home sat on the very edge of civilization, where the rolling prairies gave way to the rugged ancient Ozark Hills. It was a land with a soul much like Appalachia's, a place of tight-knit clans, fierce independence, and memories as long and deep as the valleys themselves. The roots of that spirit ran deep in Myra's blood. Her mother, Elizabeth Hatfield Shirley, came from the same line as the notorious Hatfields of the West Virginia-Kentucky border. This wasn't just a distant relation, it was a heritage. It meant that Myra was born into a world where honor was defended with fists and firearms, where loyalty to family was the highest law, and where an insult was a debt that would one day be paid in full. This was the unwritten code of the mountains, a code she understood long before she ever read a law book. On the surface, however, Myra was being molded into a proper Southern lady. Her father sent her to the Carthage Female Academy, a place of refinement and learning. She studied the classics, mastered Greek and Latin, and could fill the Shirley home with the beautiful, complex notes of a piano sonata. She was intelligent, articulate, and poised, everything a daughter of a prominent family was expected to be. She was destined for a life of quiet dignity, of ball gowns and polite conversation. But beneath the corset and silk beat the heart of a rebel. The same girl who could quote Greek philosophers was more at home in the saddle, racing her horse through the woods with a freedom most women of her time could only dream of. She preferred the company of her older brother, Bud, and his friends, learning from them the ways of the wilderness. She could handle a shotgun with a skill that shamed grown men and knew the hidden trails of the Ozarks as if they were lines on the palm of her hand. Two worlds were at war inside this young woman: the polished, respectable world her father was building for her, and the wild, untamed world of the hills that flowed in her Hatfield blood. For a time, she could walk in both. But a storm was gathering on the horizon of America, a storm of fire and steel that would sweep across the nation, and it would force Myra Maybelle Shirley to choose, once and for all, which world she truly belonged to. Little did she know that choice would burn the life she knew to the ground. If the Ozark Hills were the anvil of Myra's character, the Civil War was the hammer that shattered it and reforged it into something hard and sharp. When the war came, it didn't just divide the nation, it ripped through Missouri, turning neighbor against neighbor in a savage guerrilla conflict. The Shirley family didn't hesitate. Their loyalty was to the Confederacy, and their home soon became a clandestine way station for the most feared Southern partisans, the bushwhackers. Men like William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson, men who fought with a cold fury, found refuge under the Shirley roof. And riding with them were boys who would become legends in their own right, the James brothers and the Younger brothers. This was the world that consumed Myra Maybelle. She saw these men not as outlaws, but as heroes defending their homes. And her greatest hero was her own brother, Edwin, whom everyone called Bud. He was everything she admired: brave, defiant, and free. When he joined the bushwhackers, Myra's war began. The polite young lady from the academy vanished, replaced by a cunning operative for the Southern cause. Legends say she would use her charm and education to flirt with Union officers, prying information from them about troop movements, which she would then pass on to her brother and his comrades. She became a scout, a spy, a vital part of the shadow war being fought in the Missouri hills. For a time, it must have felt like a dangerous, righteous adventure. She was fighting alongside her brother, defending her family's beliefs. The risk was real, but so was the adrenaline, the sense of purpose. She was no longer just a girl playing piano, she was a player in the great bloody drama of her time. But this was no adventure, and the price of this war was about to be brought to her door in the most brutal way imaginable. In 1864, the hammer fell. Federal troops, tired of the constant raids and ambushes, hunted down Bud Shirley. He was trapped, cornered, and killed. For 16-year-old Myra, the news wasn't just devastating, it was the end of her world. The light of her life, her protector, her idol, was gone, slain by the very men she saw as foreign invaders. In that moment, her girlish patriotism and grief curdled into something far darker, a cold, permanent, all-consuming hatred. A hatred for the government, for its uniforms, for its laws. They had taken her brother, and in doing so, they had taken a part of her soul. The war might end for the country, but for Myra Shirley, it would never be over. She would spend the rest of her life fighting the victors. After the war, the Shirley family fled to Texas, seeking a new life from the ashes of the old. But for Myra, peace was a foreign country. Her heart, forged in hatred, was drawn to the fire. She found that fire in the eyes of the men who, like her brother Bud, refused to surrender. Men like the charismatic Cole Younger, a childhood friend and now a notorious outlaw. Rumors would later whisper of a passionate affair, claiming her daughter Pearl was his. It was a romantic story, but likely just that, a story. The truth, however, was no less dangerous. Her first husband was Jim Reed, another former bushwhacker who couldn't trade his pistol for a plow. With him, Myra stepped fully into the world of the outlaw. Their life was a blur of stolen horses and dodging posses, a frantic existence on the run. In this chaos, her two children, Pearl and Eddie, were born. But this was no family portrait. It was a partnership born of war and rebellion, and it was destined to end in blood. In 1874, Jim Reed's luck ran out. The news that reached Myra was cold and brutal. Her husband had been shot down, not in a blaze of glory, but by an acquaintance who valued the reward money more than friendship. At 26, Myra was a widow, a mother of two, and officially branded the accomplice of a dead bandit. This was the world she had chosen, a world with no honor among thieves. So she moved deeper into the shadows, to a place where the law of the United States was thin and the old ways were strong, the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. There, she met and married Sam Starr, a man from a proud Cherokee family. This wasn't just a marriage, it was the founding of a dynasty. On their land, tucked away in the rugged hills, they established a stronghold. It had a name that was a tribute to her old friends and a warning to her new enemies, Younger's Bend. Younger's Bend wasn't a ranch. It was a sanctuary for the damned. It was a place where men on the run, men like Jesse James and the Younger brothers themselves, could find a hot meal, a fresh horse, and a place to lay low, protected by the cunning of its queen. The air there was thick with the smell of wood smoke, whiskey, and paranoia. Every rider on the horizon was either a friend or a hangman. This was the heart of darkness, a kingdom built on stolen goods and guarded by guns. Here, the final transformation of Myra Maybelle Shirley was complete. She was no longer just a bandit's wife, she was the mastermind. She never led a charge, her hands weren't on the triggers during the robberies. Her weapons were her intellect and her will. She planned the heists, fenced the stolen property, bribed officials, and used her deep knowledge of the law to tangle up prosecutors in court. And she crafted an image that became a legend. She would ride into town on a fine horse, sitting side saddle in a velvet dress like a proper lady, but on her hips, for all the world to see, rested 2 Colt revolvers. She could quote classical poetry one moment and arrange the sale of a stolen herd the next. This walking contradiction, the refined lady and the criminal queen, was her armor and her declaration of war. She had created a monster, and her name was Belle Starr. The 2 shotgun blasts echoed through the hills and then faded into an unnerving quiet. Belle Starr's horse, spooked and riderless, galloped the rest of the way to the ranch house, its panicked whinny the first alarm. Her daughter Pearl, hearing the sound, ran out to see what was wrong. The discovery she made in the mud of the road, just outside their own gate, would become the final bloody chapter of her mother's legend. The Bandit Queen was dead, her velvet riding habit stained with the earth and her own blood, her back riddled with buckshot. News of a murder like that travels fast, even in the isolated Indian territory. It moved from ranch to ranch on the lips of breathless riders, then crackled across the telegraph wires to the newspapers in Fort Smith and beyond. The death of Belle Starr was an event. For the lawmen, it was the closing of a long and frustrating case file. For the dime novelists, it was a dramatic ending they couldn't have written better themselves. For the locals, it was a source of fear and feverish gossip. The Queen was dead, but who had dared to kill her? Soon enough, Deputy U.S. Marshals rode down the trail to Younger's Bend. For years, this place had been a no-go zone, a sanctuary for fugitives where the law entered at its own peril. Now, they were in charge, picking through the life of the woman who had so often made fools of them. The investigation began, and the web of suspects was tangled and dark, spun from the threads of Belle's own life. Every person in her orbit had a potential motive. The first and most obvious suspect was a man named Edgar Watson. He was a tenant on Belle's land, a man with a shadowy past from Florida, rumored to be wanted for murder himself. They had argued bitterly. Belle wanted him gone, and Watson wasn't a man who liked being told what to do. It was a simple, logical motive, a dispute over land and money that ended in violence. But the simple answer isn't always the true one. Then there was her own husband, a Cherokee man named Jim July Starr. He was younger than Belle and was, at the time of her murder, facing his own trial for horse theft. Did they have a falling out? Was he driven by jealousy? Or, as some whispered, did he arrange the murder to silence her before she could testify in some secret deal with the law? He had an alibi, but in the murky world of Younger's Bend, an alibi was just another story. The silence that fell over the hills wasn't one of peace. It was a silence of fear. Belle's network of outlaws scattered, not knowing who among them might be next or who might sell them out for a pardon. A reward was posted for information, but few dared to speak. The killer was still out there, and no one knew how far their reach extended. The hunt was on, not just for a murderer, but for the truth behind the final bloody act of the Bandit Queen's life. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but in the case of Belle Starr's murder, they seemed to grind through mud. The primary suspect, Edgar Watson, was finally brought to trial. You can just imagine the scene in the Fort Smith courtroom. It wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a spectacle. The room was packed with a tense mix of lawmen, curious townsfolk, and shadowed figures in the back rows, friends and enemies of the dead woman, all there to see how this final chapter would play out. The air itself felt heavy, thick with whispered theories and cold stares. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone was waiting for a conviction. The prosecution laid out its case. They painted a picture of a bitter dispute between a landlord and her troublesome tenant. They spoke of threats exchanged, of Watson's notorious temper, and of his presence near the scene of the crime. They presented him as a man with a motive, the means, and the opportunity. But their case was like a house built on sand. There was no murder weapon. There were no direct eyewitnesses to the shooting. The entire argument rested on bad blood and circumstantial evidence, a foundation that began to crumble under the slightest pressure. Watson, for his part, sat there with a cold confidence. He was no frightened farmer caught in the gears of the law. This was a man who understood the violence of the world. His defense lawyers didn't just deny his guilt. They threw the courtroom doors wide open to the chaos of Belle's life. They argued that putting only Edgar Watson on trial was absurd. Why not her husband, Jim July, who had his own legal troubles? Why not any of the dozens of spurned lovers, jilted partners, or vengeful victims Belle had created over the years? To have an enemy, they argued, was to be Belle Starr's acquaintance. And then, the darkest rumor of all, a chilling whisper that slithered through the courtroom, gave everyone pause. The story of Belle and her own son, Eddie. Their relationship was poison. He was a disappointment, and she was a harsh mother. The gossip was that just before her death, she had taken a whip to him for mistreating her favorite horse. Had the boy's resentment finally boiled over into an unspeakable act? Could he have pulled the trigger himself, or perhaps paid Watson to do it for him? It was a monstrous thought, but in the world Belle had built, it wasn't an impossible one. Faced with a weak case and a sea of reasonable doubt, the jury was trapped. They could condemn a man on suspicion, or they could let a potential killer walk free. They deliberated, and when they returned, the foreman's voice cut through the silence. "Not guilty." A shockwave went through the room. Edgar Watson, the man everyone was so sure had done it, stood up and walked out of the courtroom a free man. And so, the law of men had spoken. But was it justice? Or was it just a failure of a system that couldn't comprehend the complex, violent world of Younger's Bend? The court case was closed, but the murder remained unsolved. The killer had vanished back into the hills, becoming just another ghost in the bloody history of the territory. The truth, it seemed, was buried with the Bandit Queen. The murder of Belle Starr wasn't the end of the story. It was the explosion that scattered the pieces. Her kingdom, Younger's Bend, crumbled without its queen. The outlaws who had found sanctuary there drifted away, seeking new shadows to hide in. The land itself was eventually swallowed up by the relentless tide of settlement and progress. Today, what was once the most notorious hideout in the Indian Territory lies quiet and still, submerged beneath the placid waters of Lake Eufaula. A concrete historical marker stands on a nearby hill, a lone sentinel pointing toward the drowned land, the only official sign that this infamous chapter of the West ever happened here. The fates of those in her orbit were as tangled and often as tragic as her own. Edgar Watson, the acquitted suspect, moved on, but his reputation followed him. He eventually met a violent end himself, gunned down by a vigilante mob in Florida. Her last husband, Jim July Starr, died in a gunfight with lawmen not long after Belle's murder. Her son, Eddie Reed, who some whispered was the true killer, lived a troubled life, eventually becoming a deputy sheriff himself before being killed in a saloon brawl. It seems the violence that Belle had courted her whole life clung to those she left behind, an inescapable inheritance. But there is one final strange twist. Her daughter Pearl, the one rumored to be Cole Younger's child, chose a different path of rebellion. She turned her back on the world of guns and stolen horses and moved to Fort Smith, where she opened a high-class brothel. In a way, she too became a queen, presiding over her own illicit kingdom, a world with its own codes and dangers, just a stone's throw from the courthouse where her mother's killer had been set free. The strongest echo of Belle Starr, however, is not in the ground, but in the story itself. After her death, the legend took on a life of its own. A journalist named Richard Fox penned a lurid book called Belle Starr, the Bandit Queen, or the female Jesse James. It was a work of pure fiction, filled with sensational tales of her leading bank robberies and stagecoach heists, things she never actually did. This book, and the countless dime novels that followed, created the image we think of today, the pistol-packing outlaw in a feathered hat. The myth completely consumed the woman. You can still visit her grave, tucked away in the woods not far from where Younger's Bend once stood. The original headstone, carved with a bell, a star, and a poignant poem, was chipped away to nothing by souvenir hunters over the decades. A new, protected monument stands in its place. And as you stand there, in the quiet of those Oklahoma hills, you realize the mountains do remember. They remember the real Myra Maybelle Shirley, the educated girl, the grieving sister, the cunning organizer, and the woman who gambled her life on a defiant dream of freedom and lost. So we return to the question that has hung in the air since those shotgun blasts first rang out. Who killed Belle Starr? The law of men never gave us a name. Was it the vengeful tenant, Edgar Watson? Was it one of her own family, a final, terrible betrayal? We will never know for sure. But maybe the real answer isn't a name. Maybe what killed Belle Starr was the violent, lawless world she had so carefully constructed around herself. In the end, the snake she had nurtured in the heart of Younger's Bend finally turned and bit its queen. Her story is a powerful reminder that the Civil War didn't truly end at Appomattox. It continued to rage in the hearts of people like Myra Shirley, leaving scars that festered into a deep and abiding hatred for the authority that had won. She was not a hero. She was not the cartoon villain of the penny press. She was a casualty, a woman whose fierce mountain pride, when poisoned by grief, became a force of self-destruction. She waged a 25-year war against a world she felt had wronged her, and in that war, there could only be one victor. Myra Maybelle Shirley was a woman of stark contradictions, the educated lady who could quote the classics and the ruthless godmother who ruled a den of thieves. She was born with the spirit of the mountains in her blood, proud, defiant, and unforgiving. But that spirit, when broken, forged a legend written in gunsmoke and blood. A girl who was meant to be a lady became the Bandit Queen, a cautionary tale that still echoes in the hills where she once rode.